It doesn't arrive as a thought. It shows up as a pause, a moment where you would normally reach for reassurance. And don't. You still care about people. You still notice their reactions. You still register when something feels off. But the pull to be validated isn't there anymore. Not in the way it used to be. Situations arise where, before, you would have checked the tone, looked for confirmation, adjusted yourself slightly to make sure the connection felt secure. Now, you don't. You notice the opening where reassurance could be sought. And instead of moving toward it, something inside you stays quiet. Not detached. Not numb. Not disinterested. Just settled. You don't feel the need to be reassured that you're understood. You don't scan the interaction for signs of approval. You don't wait for the other person to reflect you back to yourself. And what's strange is that this doesn't feel like confidence. It doesn't feel like independence. It doesn't feel like a decision you made. It feels like something stopped asking. There's no internal statement. No boundary you rehearsed. No moment where you told yourself you were done. The behavior changes after something internal has already reorganized. And because that reorganization happened quietly, you may struggle to explain why validation no longer feels necessary. That's where the confusion starts. For others, and sometimes for you. Because for a long time, validation wasn't optional. It was how connection stayed intact, how uncertainty was softened, how belonging was quietly maintained. So when the impulse disappears, it can feel disorienting, not dramatic, not painful, just unfamiliar. And the reason this happens isn't social. It's structural. What often goes unnoticed is that validation was never just about approval. It served a deeper function. For a long time, validation acted as a stabilizer. It reduced uncertainty. It softened emotional friction. It reassured both sides that the connection was still safe. When something felt ambiguous, you didn't wait to see how it would unfold. You moved toward clarity. You checked in. You adjusted. You looked for signals that you were aligned. This wasn't insecurity. It was regulation. Validation helped your system stay oriented inside relationships. If the other person was still responding, still engaged, still emotionally present, there was less risk of rejection, conflict, or rupture. So the behavior became automatic. Not because you lacked a center, but because the environment required constant calibration, especially for empathic systems. You learned early that being attuned kept you safe, that reading the room mattered, that small adjustments prevented larger disruptions. Validation wasn't about needing praise. It was about maintaining coherence. As long as the connection felt stable, your internal state could settle. So you listened closely. You noticed subtle shifts. You responded quickly. And for a long time, it worked. But after the internal shift we are describing, something begins to feel different. The situations still arise. The ambiguity still appears. The emotional signals are still there. But the stabilizing impulse doesn't activate in the same way. You notice the moment when validation would normally intervene. And instead of moving toward reassurance, your system pauses. Not in resistance. Not in withdrawal. But because the internal need to regulate through the other person has loosened. And once that need loosens, the old behavior starts to feel slightly misaligned. Validation doesn't disappear overnight. It becomes heavier, more deliberate, more effortful. You begin to sense that you're not connecting. You're monitoring. You're not relating. You're managing. And that's when a quiet question starts to form. If this validation isn't stabilizing anything inside me anymore, why am I still reaching for it? Once you notice that validation has become effortful, you start to see how much internal movement it actually required. Before the reassurance came, there was anticipation, emotional forecasting, adjustment. You weren't just seeking connection. You were maintaining equilibrium. And none of that was wrong. It was adaptive. It was intelligent. It was necessary for a long time. But intelligence reorganizes when the structure supporting it changes. After the shift, validation begins to feel like an outdated interface. It still appears as an option, but it no longer feels connected to your center. It feels external, delayed, slightly out of sync. That's when hesitation appears. You pause before seeking reassurance, not because you're uncertain, but because you're uncertain of the need. You realize something quietly destabilizing. The moment doesn't require confirmation. The lack of response doesn't threaten your stability. The ambiguity doesn't pull you out of yourself. And because nothing collapses, the urgency dissolves. This is the point where validation begins to feel optional. Not optional in a dismissive way, optional in a grounded one. You recognize that you can remain present, without being mirrored immediately. And once you allow that, something important becomes visible. Much of what you once sought was not about worth. It was about regulation. Regulation of uncertainty. Regulation of emotional rhythm. Regulation of connection. When that regulation no longer needs to happen externally, the behavior that supported it naturally fades. This is why the change doesn't feel like a choice. You didn't decide to stop seeking validation. You noticed that seeking it no longer stabilized anything inside you. And when an action stops stabilizing the system, it releases on its own, quietly, gradually, irreversibly. After a while, you begin to notice something subtle. The situation still happens. The interaction still unfolds. The emotional signals are still there. But the inner pull doesn't activate. There's a brief pause. The same opening where you would once look for reassurance. And instead of moving toward it, you stay where you are. Not because you're withholding. Not because you're testing anyone. But because the need simply isn't there. You can feel the old habit rise for a second. The familiar reflex to check. To confirm. To make sure everything is still aligned. And then it passes. Without effort. Without resistance. What replaces it isn't indifference. It's neutrality. You're still present in the moment. You still hear what's being said. You still sense the emotional tone. But you're no longer organizing yourself around how you're being received. That's when the behavior starts to feel different from the inside. Before, seeking validation felt natural. It felt like connection, like responsiveness, like care. Now, when the impulse does appear, it feels slightly delayed, as if it's arriving from an older version of you. There's a faint sense of misalignment. Not wrong, not uncomfortable, just unnecessary. You begin to sense that reaching for reassurance no longer stabilizes you. It doesn't bring relief. It doesn't settle anything internally. And because it no longer settles anything, it starts to feel effortful. You notice how much movement it actually requires. The subtle monitoring, the emotional forecasting, the adjustment of tone or timing. You realize that you're not relating. You're managing. And that realization changes the texture of the moment. The validation you once reached for no longer feels like connection. It feels like maintenance. Not maintenance of the relationship. Maintenance of an internal equilibrium that no longer needs support. This is where confusion can arise. Because from the outside, nothing obvious has changed. You're still kind, still attentive, still responsive when it matters. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. You're no longer asking the interaction to confirm who you are. You're no longer checking whether you're okay in the other person's eyes. And when that check disappears, the behavior that depended on it begins to loosen. This doesn't happen all at once. At first, it shows up as a delay, a longer pause before responding, a moment where you let silence sit without filling it. Then it becomes restraint, shorter confirmations, fewer emotional follow-ups, less explanation of your internal state. Not because you're hiding, but because you're no longer compelled to present yourself in a particular way. You start to notice something important. The moment doesn't collapse when validation is absent. The connection doesn't disappear. Nothing breaks. And because nothing breaks, urgency fades. You realize that you can remain coherent without being mirrored immediately, that you can stay present without being confirmed in real time. This is the point where validation begins to feel optional. Not optional in a dismissive sense, optional in a grounded one. You recognize that the impulse wasn't about truth. It wasn't even about connection. It was about regulation. Regulation of uncertainty. Regulation of emotional rhythm. Regulation of belonging. And when regulation no longer needs to happen externally, the behavior that supported it starts to fall away. Not as a rejection. Not as a boundary. As a consequence. You didn't decide to stop seeking validation. You noticed that seeking it no longer served a function. And when a behavior loses its function, the system releases it quietly, without drama, without announcement, just as naturally as it once appeared. In Jungian terms, what's changing here isn't personality, it's orientation. For a long time, your inner system relied on something external to stay aligned. Not approval in a superficial sense, but feedback. Validation wasn't just reassurance. It was direction. It told the ego where it stood, whether it was safe, whether it belonged. This is why seeking validation carried so much energy. It wasn't about feeling good. It was about staying oriented. Jung described this dynamic through what he called the ego-self-axis, the relationship between conscious identity and the deeper organizing center of the psyche. When that axis is unstable, the ego looks outward to steady itself. It tracks reactions. It reads emotional signals. It adjusts behavior to maintain coherence. Validation becomes part of that system, not as weakness, but as compensation, a way to borrow orientation from the outside, when it isn't fully available inside. This is especially true for empathic systems. Highly sensitive psyches tend to develop strong relational awareness early. They learn to locate themselves through response, through resonance, through emotional feedback. Over time, this creates a pattern. External confirmation becomes the bridge between inner experience and felt stability. But after the kind of internal shift we are describing, that bridge begins to lose relevance, not because the world changes, but because the axis stabilizes. The ego no longer needs constant external input to remain aligned with the self. And when that happens, something very specific occurs. The stimuli still arrive. The social cues are still registered, but the complexes tied to validation lose their charge. In Jung's language, a complex is an emotionally charged cluster. It forms around repeated experiences: belonging, rejection, approval, abandonment. For a long time, validation activated these complexes. It pulled energy. It triggered movement. It demanded response. Now, the stimulus appears, and the charge dissolves. Not because you suppress it, not because you resist it, but because there's no longer anything inside you that needs it to orient itself. The impulse still rises, for a moment, and then it fades, before it becomes action, before it turns into behavior. This is why seeking validation starts to feel unnecessary. Not wrong, not dramatic, just irrelevant. The energy that once moved outward no longer leaks in the same way. Jung spoke of this as a reallocation of psychic energy. When inner conflict resolves, energy stops being spent on mediation and repair. It gathers inward. And when energy gathers inward, behavior simplifies. You stop reaching. You stop adjusting. You stop scanning for confirmation. Not because you've become indifferent, but because the system no longer needs to compensate. Orientation is already present. This is why the change feels quiet. There's no realization, no sense of achievement, no moment where you declare independence. Just a gradual shift in where coherence comes from. You're no longer locating yourself through how others respond to you. You're located, and because you're located internally, validation loses its organizing power. It no longer pulls behavior toward it. It no longer determines movement. It becomes optional, not as a belief, but as a structural consequence. And when a behavior loses its charge at this level, it doesn't need to be unlearned. It simply releases, which is why, from the outside, the change can be hard to explain, and from the inside, it can feel strangely effortless. The internal shift doesn't stay invisible for long, even if you don't announce it, even if you don't change your language deliberately, even if you remain kind, attentive, and present. Something feels different, because many relationships were quietly organized around your responsiveness, around your willingness to check in, to adjust, to reassure. When that stabilizing function fades, the structure of the relationship is exposed, and exposure creates discomfort. People begin to sense that something has changed, not in what you say, but in what you no longer rush to do. You don't immediately confirm emotional alignment. You don't soften ambiguity right away. You don't step in to manage the atmosphere. And because these behaviors were once expected, their absence is often misread. Some people experience it as distance. They may tell you that you seem different, less warm, less available, harder to read. Others don't name it directly. Instead, they test the connection. They increase emotional intensity. They repeat stories you've already responded to. They push for reaction, not because they want conflict, but because they are trying to restore a familiar rhythm. For a long time, your responsiveness reassured them. It told them the connection was intact, that they were still oriented, that nothing had shifted beneath the surface. Now, that reassurance isn't automatic, and the absence of it creates uncertainty. This is often when guilt appears, because you were taught that care meant responsiveness, that presence required emotional participation, that silence implied withdrawal. So when you don't step in to validate, part of you may wonder if you're doing something wrong. You may feel the pull to repair the discomfort, to clarify that you still care, to explain that nothing is wrong. And sometimes you do, not because it feels aligned, but because the tension feels heavier than the effort it takes to reassure. This is where the stage becomes difficult, because the pressure to return doesn't come from ego. It comes from habit, from years of learning that connection depended on your willingness to smooth emotional edges. But what becomes visible here is something subtle and important. Not all relationships were sustained by mutual presence. Some were sustained by your regulation. When that regulation stops happening automatically, the difference becomes clear. Some relationships adapt. They slow down. They become quieter. They rely less on reassurance and more on shared presence. Others begin to strain, not because you withdrew, but because the dynamic required constant validation to function. This is often where a quieter kind of loneliness appears. Not dramatic, not acute, a subtle sense of being slightly out of sync. You may find yourself surrounded by people and still feel a bit apart, not because you're disconnected, but because the way you connect has changed. You're no longer relating through urgency. You're no longer bonding through reassurance. You're no longer maintaining closeness through emotional monitoring. And many people don't know how to relate outside of that structure. This can feel like loss, not necessarily of people, but of a familiar way of belonging. There may be moments when the simplicity of old dynamics feels tempting, when being immediately mirrored felt easier, when reassurance flowed without friction. But what's being missed isn't connection. It's predictability. And predictability often depended on your willingness to confirm, adjust, and validate. Now, presence comes first, and validation, if it comes at all, emerges naturally, or not at all. This is the social consequence of the shift. You're no longer organizing yourself around emotional maintenance. You're allowing relationships to respond to who you are now, not to who you were when validation was automatic. And that reorganization, while quiet, is not reversible, because once you stop seeking validation to preserve connection, you can't return to it without feeling the cost. When validation no longer organizes your behavior, something subtle changes, not just inside you, but in how the world responds. And this is where confusion often begins, because the absence of validation seeking can look like many things. It can look like distance. It can look like indifference. It can look like emotional withdrawal. And without context, people fill in the gaps. This is where the most common mistake appears. Some people assume they must compensate. They start explaining more, reassuring more, offering clarity they don't actually feel, not because they want validation back, but because the discomfort of being misread feels heavier than the effort it takes to correct it. Others move in the opposite direction. They stop engaging. They stop responding. They stop making themselves available at all. They mistake restraint for detachment. Both responses come from the same place: disorientation. Because for a long time, validation didn't just regulate you. It regulated the relationship. It told both sides where they stood. When that signal disappears, the shared map collapses. And without a shared map, people don't know how to locate you or themselves. This is where tension enters. Not dramatic tension, not conflict, a quieter unease. You may notice conversations feel slightly off. Responses don't land the way they used to. Silences stretch longer than expected. Not because you've changed your values, but because you've stopped providing orientation. This is where many people misunderstand the stage. They assume the discomfort means something is wrong, that connection is being lost, that something needs to be repaired. But what's actually happening is simpler and more unsettling. The old way of relating no longer functions, and without validation acting as a stabilizer, relationships are forced to reorganize. Some adjust. They slow down. They rely less on reassurance. They tolerate ambiguity. Others don't. They push for clarity. They seek reaction. They try to restore the previous rhythm. And when that rhythm doesn't return, they experience it as absence, even if you're still present. This is where the real risk lies, not in becoming distant, but in misunderstanding the discomfort. If you interpret this tension as a signal to harden, you drift into isolation. If you interpret it as a signal to compensate, you drift back into patterns you've already outgrown. Neither response reflects what's actually happening. What's happening is loss of shared orientation. And loss of shared orientation feels destabilizing, even when nothing is wrong. The challenge here isn't deciding what to do. It's tolerating the moment, when connection no longer tells you who you are. If this resonates, it doesn't mean you've become detached. It means validation no longer organizes your inner world. And when that happens, the world doesn't always know how to respond. You're still present, still capable of care, still engaged when it matters. But you're no longer offering constant signals that tell others where you stand. And without those signals, people begin to experience you differently. Not because you withdrew, but because you stopped orienting yourself through them. This is why, after this shift, many people report something unexpected. They don't just feel calmer. They feel harder to read, harder to place, harder to locate emotionally. And that change triggers reactions: confusion, distance, sometimes resistance. Not because you've done something wrong, but because validation once made you legible. When it disappears, something else is required. Not explanation, not reassurance, but tolerance for ambiguity. And that's not something everyone has. In the next stage, the question is no longer why you stopped seeking validation. It's why, without it, you begin to feel invisible to some and unsettling to others. That's where the shift becomes impossible to ignore.